One of the next things we have to focus on in our scene is how to populate it with lots of grass and plants and shrubberies and things like that on the ground. They're more frequent than trees. They happen all over, like little clumps of grass here and here and here. But they might not be so good to have as gigantic high polygon meshes. Especially when you get back here, the amount of detail that you're going to get out of a grass simulation is not worth it for 5 to 6 pixels. And that's where using cards come in. We're going to look at a few ways that we can create assets that we then can populate a terrain with. Now, here I have 3 little clumps of grass that I made in Maya, and you can make these just as easily as I did. All you have to do is go to the visor, and you can scroll through the various options that they have for meshes that you can create. One of which is things like plants or grass. Grasses. I ended up using this little one here, grass ornament. You could very quickly just grab one and you start drawing. Stuff like that. Now here I have 3 different strokes that I made using this grass ornament brush. And this is not actually what we're going to use in the scene. If we had a scene that started off and focused very strongly on something that's right up here, and you're looking at grass, then maybe having this amount of grass is worth having. But for a project with a budget that can afford a single person working on it, aka your assignments, that's not really worth it. But it is useful as a tool to make those assets. Now first off, when you make this, it has 2 options in the Paint Effects nodes. One is the actual brush setup grass starting point that it came with. And the other is this stroke. Now the stroke is interesting because you can go into the pressure mappings and change it. And this will separate this grass from this grass, even though they're using the same brush. So on this one, it's assuming that although they're all using the same brush, perhaps this one, let's say you were using a tablet, you could actually have these mapped to the tablet, and some of them are going to have stronger or weaker strokes. We can also change what each one is working on. So all I did for these is I went in and changed, I left most of their settings the same. But I changed tubes per step on some of them to be more or less. You end up choosing the maximum because if you're like me and you're using a mouse, you're not actually applying any pressure, so it's not useful to move that. Similarly, I moved the scale around to make these bigger or smaller. And you can even go in and type in something like 8 to make gigantic grass. Now from here, you can create a mesh by going in the Paint Effects tab over here and clicking on this brush that turns it into a mesh. It's not necessary, but I like doing that because then you can go and modify the settings even more for the material. So now if you look, this has material attributes for pardon me. Material attributes. There we are. So what's great is you can actually learn a lot by turning Paint Effects into meshes and then going and looking at what their meshes even were. So if I have this selected and I go to the Hypershade, click that, Oops. Graph the network. Now this has a ramp applied to its color, and that's it. But on other ones you can find interesting things where they're using different nodes to do different things. Now what's great is that now that we have these, we can just take a quick render and we have grass particles. All I did to get my camera set up was I went into its attributes, I took away any rotation, and I changed the camera to be looking at them from this plane. I also have my settings changed to, first off, be in mental ray, and in indirect lighting I created a physical sun and sky, global illumination, and final gathering, just as a way to start off with all the useful bells and whistles. Then when you render this, you have some grass. And you can see another reason that it's good to close out, turn it into a mesh. Oftentimes this doesn't render with mental ray, or it assumes that you might want to grow it as a stroke. So it's good to close it out by turning it into a mesh. And then it should render. There we are. See? Now it renders. Now once you have that render, all you have to do is save it as a ping and we can start working on it in Photoshop. I was zoomed in much more when I did this, but all you do is save image. And I start off by using pings. PNG is a format that has the alpha channel explicit. It's more like a Photoshop layer. And although that's not what we want to save it as, that's useful for when we're just working on it and editing it in Photoshop. And if you click this, you can see where the alpha channel is. I think I messed with some of these colors by modifying that ramp material. Now, all that I did was save these out. Here's an example of one. And I just brought that into Photoshop over here. Here you can see the original ones. The next step is to make these into alpha card objects. So to do that, I started by taking any given individual one of these. I talked about some of these in class earlier, but I like to use a plugin called Solidify. Filter, Solidify, Flaming Pair Solidify. You have to actually install this from the internet, and you might know about a place that has this a little better. It's by Flaming Pair, and if you download it, you end up going into, they have instructions on where to save this in Photoshop. If this is too much work for you, you can always just do it the lazy way, sample a color, and fill the whole background in that. But then what I end up doing is, if I delete this I can show it to you again. So I'll duplicate this. And because when I rendered this, it had that environment behind it, it actually does have a little bit of blue sky saved in this, and we don't want that. So I will click on this, control click on this, control clicking on a layer selects those pixels that are on that layer. And now I can shrink this selection with modify, contract. I actually have a hotkey for that, and I recommend you do too. I'll contract it by 1 pixel. I can invert it, and then on this bottom one, I'll just hit delete a bunch. You might think you only have to delete once, but what actually happens is some of these are saved as half pixels, and so although they don't look selected, you have 40% of a blue sky pixel selected, and so you have to delete that more than once to get it deleted multiple times. Now if I solidify this, we have a background that's based on that. Just to show you what happens if we don't have that, here it's going to pull from those blue pixels and not have true green. You'll notice that this still actually has that blue edge, so we might want to get rid of that, especially since now we have this solidify. But this layer is still very useful because we can use this to set our alpha channel. So I will click this, and then in my channels, go down here, and add a new channel like that. And that created this channel over here. So now we can end up seeing this as, sorry, I just lost my channels. So now we can end up seeing this as, or saving this with just this channel. So I would end up right clicking and delete these channels right before saving. And save it as a target. And because I don't want that pixels, but this solidify is actually pretty accurate, I'll just save it with this layer turned off. And I save that as a target. Now, if we look at one of these, you can see why targas are preferable. So here we have complete opacity, but in our channels we still have that alpha channel. And what that means is when Maya or Blender is trying to find out what color to make in a mostly transparent pixel, it'll be able to say specifically this color, and it won't have to guess. And oftentimes when you're doing that, you end up having to pre-multiply or use white. But we want a transition from opaque green to transparent green. This seems really like a convoluted process, but when you end up struggling to get rid of this stupid white edge for hours on end, you'll thank me. Once you have those cards, you can very quickly just add them as a texture. Now, one thing I would recommend using is MIA materials. So if you right click and assign new materials, it's under Mental Ray, MIA Material X. And when you do that, you get this weird node, and over here is your actual material. And you want to click presets, and I ended up using a matte finish replace, because this grass I don't want it to be too shiny. Window. Editors. Hypershade. And window. Node editor. So these are the two windows you end up using to make node materials, which is they're going to end up doing these. Why do I end up using this material instead of just a Lambert? If you end up using fancy things in Mental Ray, such as indirect lighting, image-based lighting, global illumination, or final gathering, you can get a problem where even when you go in and change the shadow attenuation on this, these alpha cards are going to cast weird shadows. So I recommend using one of these. Now if I graph this new material that I just made, I'll graph it over here, we can start adding some textures in here and see how they change as we add them. Under color, I'm going to add a file node, and we would just want to find one of our grasses. Well, next up, although this would automatically hook up your alpha channel if you were using a Lambert or something, it doesn't do it here, so we're going to have to do it manually. And this is where you can see one of those weird quirks of Maya, which is if we take the out alpha and put it into the transparency of this, it actually uses the opposite of what we want for our transparency. It's a really dumb, silly thing, and I don't understand why they do it, but it gives us an opportunity to learn a little bit more about the node editor, because it's something that you should start getting comfortable. The quicker you can get really flexible with this, the more powerful you're going to be at rendering things. So we could just go into Photoshop and in our alpha channel reverse this with Control I. However, you can just do this in the nodes and it's just as good, if not better, because we're not going to be destructive to the normal alpha formation. So if I wanted to reverse this, I would go into my node editor, and I would start by adding a reverse node. If you hit tab and start typing in reverse, it shows up. You can arrow down and hit enter, and it'll show up as a node. Sorry, I lost my hotkeys. Now, with this reverse node, I can go over here and say out alpha to input X. And all that says is all the black pixels go into input X, and all the white pixels go into input X. And all the gray pixels go in there as well. But now if I say output X to transparency instead, this is going to work now. And all that did is use nodes to flip this. So now when I render this, it'll work correctly. One additional thing that's worth knowing as you mess with things in here, you might notice this small little sliver of pixels here. That's just caused by the texture trying to wrap around and accidentally grabbing some of these pixels down here on the bottom. One of the easy ways to fix this is just to go into your UV node and just change this from repeat UV to 0.99 and 0.99. And that'll say your UVs are slightly tighter in on this one-to-one grid of UVs. And then you won't have that. You could also instead go in and select your grass node and change its filter type to off, and then it'll be those harsh pixels. But if you want the quadratic filter, it's often okay. There's one other thing that is worth knowing. So I did this for all three of these materials, and in each one we just had grass 1, 2, or 3. But this is a perfect example of where you would want to use a texture atlas for your process. When I make these 3 different materials, each with their own node, this one has a material, this one has a different material, and this one has a different one as well. That means that all 3 of these are going to have different materials getting called up by the program, and all 3 of them are going to have a different texture called up. So although it's using a relatively similar amount of space in terms of how much texture you're actually using, the existence of extra files is going to waste time. Additionally, on grass like this, or if you had one that was long and thin, or possibly like a tree that was that way, you're wasting all of this texture space up here. And this is a great place that it would be good to have a grid that said this was instead on 2 128 places. So that's where we get to this last one, which is the example that uses a texture card. All 3 of these use the exact same material. And the way they do that is instead, I made my initial grass on this file. I started by adding a grid using the slice tool. If you go over here and get the slice tool, you can right click and say divide slice. Oops. Let's open the Photoshop document. Oh no, maybe I didn't say that. There it is. So, when you right click, you can say divide slice, and then specify how many slices you want. So I could say 4 or by 4, and that would add a grid of 4 by 4. So when this was just one giant slice, I did that to make it an 8 by 8 grid. Then when I placed these layers, I ended up using almost the same thing, but when I placed them, I tried to make sure that each grass was using up some amount of the grid system in a logical way. So for instance, this one uses up most of this one. And I could actually even re-render this a little higher up so that it uses more of this space. This one uses most of these two boxes, and this one uses these two boxes. Then, after saving this out and largely using the same process to create a set of solidified edges and also create channels for this, I'm able to, in Maya, just have 3 separate objects, each with different UV unwraps. Window, new texture editor. So if you look at these, all I did now is turn on grid snap, or actually I used the manual typing in method. And you can now type in over here. You can manually type in 0.5 or 0.125 or 0.25 to say these are explicitly that far into the grid on the Y direction. Or similarly, on the X direction, 1, on the Y direction, 1 or 0.5 or 0.25 or 0.125. And as a result, this one actually doesn't end up being a card. It ends up being a rectangle. It's still a card, but it's not a square, I mean. Next up, we're going to look at how you can use this variety of grasses using XGen to populate your terrain.